brokers can take it back.
So it is a strong political agenda.
Yeah.
Elizabeth, you define yourself as a pragmatist, an American school of thought mostly associated with John Dewey. I would like to know your definition of pragmatism, a little known intellectual school in Latin America, and what is its current relevance when applied to political, moral, and cultural challenges of contemporary society.
Yeah. Pragmatism is a non-ideal, problem-focused mode of inquiry. So the idea is that we begin our philosophical explorations with problematic experiences that maybe we're not comfortable with, but we haven't come to full articulation of what's going wrong. We just feel that something's wrong. And we try to come to an articulation of what precisely is wrong in the process of trying to find solutions to that problem. And that is a learning process that takes place through experiments in different ways of coming to terms with the problem, different policies or practices. And it's that continuing learning process, learning from the experience of living out our ideas and our ideals. It's that process through which we can make moral progress. That, in a nutshell, is what pragmatism is about. So we start with not with an ideal conception of what would be perfectly just, but rather with the problems as experienced in our lives, and then move from there.
Okay. You don't write on a plane of abstractions or reduce the complexity of the world to a system. You philosophize from very concrete experiences. I would like to know what public function you assign to philosophy, the humanities, and the social sciences beyond the world of academia.
Absolutely. So, because I'm a pragmatist, what I want to focus on is how these disciplines can help us understand the problems that we confront in our experiences and come to terms with them. So it's from there that I think philosophy needs to be deeply connected to the social sciences, which give us empirical information that's critical, especially causal information about what causes what. And philosophy then brings in a variety of evaluative perspectives to help us understand our predicaments and to think through what causal levers it makes sense to push, because there are always side effects, and sometimes it could be, say, disrespectful to push certain causal levers. So we should set those aside and work on alternatives.
For you, what does freedom consist of? What does equality consist of? And how are both ideas related inside the framework of a democratic society?
Yeah, that's a great question, because current political discourse often treats freedom and equality as opposed to each other. Well, if you want equality, then we have to give up on freedom. And there's no question that there are certain conceptions of equality that would drive us in that direction. But that's because we've misconceived both freedom and equality. So if we look, say, at certain totalitarian communist regimes, they purported to achieve equality, and they did definitely reduce economic inequality, but at terrible cost to human freedom. But they also at great cost to equality, because these totalitarian systems put some people in domination over others. right? It's the bosses of the party now are ruling everybody else. That's not egalitarian. So they didn't even really fully understand equality, as well as not understanding the value of freedom. So in my conceptualization of freedom and equality, they're actually quite closely joined. If we go back to the Republican tradition of theorizing freedom, this small r Republican, Republicanism defines freedom as not being subject to the arbitrary will of another, not being subject to domination. But if nobody's dominating anyone else, then that's also a condition of social equality. So freedom and equality become very tightly joined at that point. And we can see then how we can develop our ideals of freedom and equality jointly rather than conceiving them as always in conflict or in tension with each other.
So your concept of liberty is more Republican than liberal?
Well, I also think, and this is actually a deep theme in pragmatism, liberalism is a legitimate successor tradition to republicanism, and they're not that sharply opposed as one might think. That in fact, if you examine classical liberal conceptions of liberty more deeply, you can see they're coming straight out of the Republican tradition. And even contemporary liberalism still provides the kinds of protections and stability from domination when you actually examine these ideals more closely.
Okay. Contemporary societies or democracies, this happens in the US as well as in Chile, are full of emotions that promote what you have called toxic political discourses. I'm thinking of resentment, fear, contempt, and a sense of moral superiority. All these feelings distract us from social problems and prevent us from finding common ground to face them. Why are these emotions predominant, and what can be done to counteract them? And how can we citizens in such polarized societies build trust or ways of engaging in common tasks despite our ideological differences?
That's such a deep question, and we see this problematic discourse across many democracies, not just United States and Chile, India, Turkey, Brazil, Hungary, these kinds of discourses in which certain groups are constituted as enemies or frightening, horrible people out to do horrible things, right? It's about the construction of certain demonized groups who then purportedly need to be subordinated or excluded. That lies at the heart of what political scientists call populist discourse in the sort of, it's a contested term, populism. But populism understood as a deeply anti-pluralist idea, that the majority identity group in society gets to dictate terms to all these other groups or exclude them or subordinate them in various ways. And at the heart of that lie modes of communication that foment contempt, fear, and distrust of these hated groups. It turns out that in modern democracies across the world, we're facing problems of rising inequality, economic dislocation, environmental crisis, and also demographic transitions that are worrying to a lot of people. Birth rates are going down, the population's aging, especially birth rates of the majority identity group in various societies, and rising immigration, I think, are series of causes that are leading to certain kinds of panic on the part of traditional national majorities in a variety of countries, and providing fertile ground for populist politicians to sow distrust and fear. The way out of that is to focus relentlessly on what I call first order political discourse, which is about problem solving, and bend over backwards to avoid disparaging judgments about who's good, who's bad, who's superior, who's inferior, because it's those group-based disparaging judgments of others that are the fundamental cause of communication breakdown. The moment somebody feels that another person is insulting them or acting superior to them, their hackles get raised, they resist whatever is being proposed, they think it's just a ruse to put them down, and then you just get complete communication breakdown. And that actually also happens on the left. It's not just a right-wing thing. On the left too, we see the rise of certain, what the right calls cancel culture, right? Instead of trying to engage constructively and listen to the other side, and just a desire to just shut them down. And what I think needs to happen is more listening and more respect. And that means rigorously avoiding insulting discourse, even if you deeply disagree with the other person.
And if we think about democratic practices, what examples of historical and contemporary experiments in living are inspiring for social justice?
Going back historically, some of my work addresses the abolition of slavery as a major marker of moral progress for societies. Now, in the United States, it took a civil war to abolish slavery. But in fact, the simple abolition of laws permitting slavery is not enough to end involuntary servitude. And in fact, the framers of the 13th Amendment of the United States Constitution, under which slavery was abolished, were vividly aware of the fact that slave-like conditions can exist even after the abolition of laws that permit property in other people. And in fact, there was enormous disputation in the United States after the Civil War about what freedom consisted in, and in particular, what free labor amounts to. Because just because you abolish an injustice doesn't mean that you know what's to replace it. But you still needed a labor regime of some sort or other. And so a lot of my work is exploring historically what kinds of experiments in alternative labor regimes have been tried, and in the attempt to achieve free labor, genuinely free labor, and what we can learn from those experiments. And in fact, there's been in the United States a very long struggle against certain oppressive post-slavery labor regimes, such as sharecropping in the United States and various forms of debt peonage, which in fact are unconstitutional. But it took a long time to overthrow them, and even to this day, various operations of creditors have succeeded in reimposing new forms of arguably debt peonage, especially for undocumented immigrants actually who suffer from this, because they had to borrow a lot of money to come into the United States, and now they are under the domination of the people who loaned them that money. It puts them in a very precarious position. But not just undocumented immigrants, but all kinds of people have found themselves entangled in credit situations which have made them deeply unfree. So the struggle for freedom is a continuous struggle because people are always figuring out ways, skirting the law, to impose these kinds of unfree regimes. So my work is trying to uncover, well, okay, how did we handle this before? Maybe we can learn lessons about mistakes as well as successes in order to move that struggle forward and actually achieve progress.
Democratic egalitarianism is one of your concerns. Can you tell me something about its history? What can we learn from past experiences? And what is the role of social movements in advancing in this direction?
Yeah, it's so democratic social movements are at the heart of progress towards equality. And indeed, this is a deep lesson that we got from abolitionists who had the most successful and striking social movements against slavery. Almost all of the repertoire of contemporary social movements was invented by abolitionists, mostly in Britain. They invented the repertoire, and then social movements have been building on the techniques that were invented by the abolitionists to expand and deepen democratic equality throughout the world ever since. What is it about social movements that is so powerful in terms of helping people learn about injustice and solutions to it? It's the coming together of diverse people around a social agenda that is also empirically responsible, and that's critical. We've had historically utopian movements which are not particularly democratic because someone has in their head a vision that they just want to impose. And maybe they call that vision egalitarian, but really it was just in their head and not actually the product of collective experience among people from a wide range of views. And in that case, it just becomes ideological and dogmatic rather than responsive to the diverse experiences of people living under those plans, those systems. So that's why I think for a social movement to really make progress and advance equality, it has to be democratic at its root, so that we can actually learn from the lessons.
In your book, The Imperative of Integration, you defend racial integration in the US as a basic element of social justice and the functioning of democracy. Segregation, for example, in schools or neighborhoods, produces forms of stigmatization that threaten a democratic culture. I think it is interesting to talk about this in Chile, because ours is a very segregated society in terms of class and with a growing migrant population. Could you say something about this in general terms?
Yes. So segregation is fundamentally caused by advantaged groups who are hoarding opportunities to themselves and drawing tight boundaries between their own social identity and the people beneath them in order to basically keep these opportunities to themselves and prevent sharing or access to those opportunities except on very disadvantageous terms. That means that segregation lies at the core of class inequality as well. And of course we observe that. The better off reserve better schools for themselves. They engage in social networking so that their children have privileged access to better jobs through the networks of people who control the gateways to careers. And that's why if segregation is the cause of inequality, then integration is an answer. But we have to be careful, because integration doesn't just mean people who are in proximity. It actually means active cooperation as equals. So that means that just having a diverse population, say, within a school is not enough to achieve integration. The school would have to actively promote friendship, interaction, have integrated sports teams, all kinds of activities have to promote intergroup cooperation. And then what we find is people learn from that experience that the other is not so scary, and also non-inferior.
In your latest book, Private Government, you deal with the growing power of employers over employees in the US. You have even defined the bosses as dictators, and this autocratic power extends beyond the workplace. What are the effects of this phenomenon on democracy and freedom in general? Do you think that what you warn of happening in the US is potentially valid for other countries as well?
Oh, it's definitely bad. So, democracy, a vibrant political democracy, requires experience of democracy in day-to-day life. Given that workers today spend about a third of their hours at work, or perhaps more, that's a significant domain where contemporary citizens of democracies don't actually live out a democratic way of life. That's deeply problematic. Where else are they going to be learning it and practicing it? And indeed, we know from Pinochet, he wanted to systematically eradicate democracy in every domain to tighten hierarchy of employers over workers in very sharp terms, destroy labor unions, destroy any opportunities for workers to have a voice in how their work lives were arranged and how their employers were operating. And Pinochet also extended that even to private clubs and associations. They weren't allowed to practice democracy either. If anyone had a grasp of how much the experience of a democratic way of life would have the potential of spreading out to other domains, it was Pinochet, and that's why he wanted to shut it all down, right? And that's one of the reasons why I think it's critical to have a vibrant democracy, that workers also have voice within the firm, how it's organized and what it aims for. We see this today in the United States, a rise in experiences of moral injury. And workers find that the corporation they're working for is dealing with pretty immoral practices. And they themselves are getting burnt out, stressed out, and very disillusioned because they feel trapped in employment situations where they're pursuing goals that they can't sign on to. Notoriously, this is happening in the tech field. Workers don't want to be working on helping China censor the news in China. There's been revolts at Google for this. Revolts against facial recognition technology, which has been used to track, dissidents in China. I think those workers need to be empowered to rein in immoral projects. At Amazon, workers have been striking against climate change and Amazon's role in spewing out greenhouse gases. If workers were empowered, we would have, I think, more decent corporations, more morally responsible corporations.
The subtitle of the book, Private Government, is How Employers Rule Our Lives and Why We Don't Talk About It. What is the reason for the concerning lack of dialogue about autocracy at workplace?
Yeah, so this is I think, peculiarly American story. I don't know how far it spreads, but in the United States, from colonial times on, the ideal of free labor was always connected to self-employment. And indeed, in colonial times, the United States had by far the highest share of self-employed people, probably in any country on earth. The reason for this is that land was free to white people. And of course, that was achieved at very grave cost and great brutality against indigenous peoples in the United States. But it opened up unparalleled opportunities for ordinary workers. They get their own plot of land. They were not subject to a landlord. They weren't serfs. And even in manufacturing, you had a lot of small crafts workers. You had budding professions in law and so forth, where people could just hang out a shingle and just do their thing. And that ideal remains an incredibly powerful ideal for American workers today. And that's why we don't talk about employer dominance so much, because we're still fixated on this other model and with a kind of mirage that it's always available. This chasing after this ideal of self-employment as the ultimate form of free labor, I think, has mystified what really goes on. For the vast majority of workers, they're not free. They have to take orders from the boss, and speaking up gets them fired, complaining gets them fired, even though under American labor law, it's totally illegal to fire somebody for complaining about working conditions. Nevertheless, it's routine, the laws are not enforced, and workers who have a complaint find themselves in a deep predicament. Case in point, 70% of workers who've experienced sexual harassment in the workplace never report it, even though it's completely illegal. Why? Because they're going to face retaliation from their employer for reporting it. So I actually have to say this. I got the statistic wrong. 70% of employees who file a formal complaint of sexual harassment face retaliation. And the rest are silenced because they could see the consequences, right?
Well, thanks, Elizabeth, for your insightful conversation.
Yeah, thank you. Wonderful questions.
Thanks.